Welcome to Ignite Your Confidence for women in leadership who want to speak up and stand out. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Here you'll get all of the tips and tools that you need to stand out with unshakable confidence. Let's dive into today's episode. Let's talk about interviews and how to prep as well as nail them so you can get that job that you want. One of the stories I most remember was when I was coaching a woman at Genentech, the large biotech here in the Bay Area. I was coaching her because she had an internal opportunity to potentially go for, at least to interview for. And I started with role play, as I always do, and asked her, tell me about yourself, or basically said, tell me about yourself as if I was the hiring manager. So backing up for a minute, we did a mock interview, and that's the standard interview question, as we all know. And she definitely told me about herself. She gave lots of detail, and I had to stop her and say, time out. All of that is really great information about who you are. The problem is, if I'm the hiring manager, first of all, you've got to know your audience. I'm trying to figure out what is the reason, what makes you a good fit in the quickest amount of time. So I'm probably stacking you up against 3 to 5 other candidates potentially. And how can you create focus for me so that I can make the quickest decision possible? And so what I said to her was, instead of, for example, telling me 10 pieces of detail to me that I now have to filter through and figure out what is the most relevant, you want to make sure that you control that conversation by telling me what is the lead of your story. So for example, I said, what's the most important thing you want me to know about you related to this job? And she said, well, I love research. And that's what that's what the job requires. So I said, great, say that. So we did it again, second role play. I said, tell me about yourself. And she said, well, before I get into any detail, what I most want you to know about me is that I love research. Right there, the lead of her story is clear. There's no ambiguity. She got to the point and she was able to then continue from there. And these are simple things that we simply don't often think about. Very important to consider your audience, know what is it from their angle that they would most want to hear. And I have interviewed hundreds of people, maybe even thousands in my life. And it is very interesting how some really stand out and most people don't stand out. I hate to say it. Some people do. And I want to help you stand out. So let's think about some of these tips. I've got them here as my handy notes would show me. If you are preparing, the first thing that you want to think about is, what is the one thing that you want people interviewing to know about you? Similar to what I just said. Do your research, figure out what is it that is most required in the job and how you're the right person for that job. So make a connection there. And as Donald Miller says, if you confuse, you lose. If you give too many details, you're going to confuse people and then they'll probably tune out. The other thing that I love that he says is, if a person has to burn too many calories to be staying attuned to what you're saying, they likely will also tune out. And usually if we are trying to burn too many calories, it's because you're giving too much information or information in an unorganized format, and it takes too much brain power to try to listen and stay with you. The second, oh, by the way, I have 5 tips here for you. The second tip is to practice your PPU intro. This is, if you don't know it already, it's a great formula for introducing yourself and staying focused. You know how a lot of times when people ask you to introduce yourself, you don't always know what to say. And you're going, I'm not really sure. What do I say today? And it's different every time. I would recommend that you have this PPU ready in your pocket to use at any time. And it stands for personal, professional, unique. What this means specifically is, say something personal. Usually geographic orientation is good. Then the professional, what do you do or what do you want to move into? And then the unique is what's different about you. So let's just say, if they were to say the typical beginning, tell me about yourself, The first thing I would recommend is what we already talked about, is the one thing you want them to know that's directly related to the job. And then you could transition to a quick overview. Personally, I'm originally from Minneapolis, but now I live in San Francisco. Professionally, I am very excited to be on my mission of coaching people, particularly women, to overcome self-doubt and speak with confidence. Something unique about me that most people don't know is that I always had this dream of living in Manhattan. So for the month of my 50th birthday, I lived in Manhattan. I rented an apartment there and had the time of my life. That's an example of the PPU. That can be used anywhere, frankly. And I would highly recommend you use it because most intros go way too long. And this helps you stick to about 20 seconds, maybe 30, but keeping yourself succinct will be really helpful. I will say this. A lot of people say, well, I don't know what's unique about me. And we tend to get tripped up on feeling like we don't know what's unique about us. It doesn't have to be some big thing like living in Manhattan for a month, but it could be something as simple as my favorite place to vacation is here, or what's on my bucket list is this. It really depends on whatever that you want to share. And remember that you're more unique than you think. Because we live with ourselves our entire lives, we're in our own bodies. So a lot of times we have no thought really about what sets us apart. So this could also be a good time to ask other people. Okay, let's move on to the third one, which is to make a list of questions that you want them to ask and prepare for those. A lot of times we are letting the interviewer be in control. You have a lot more control than you think. And take it from somebody that's interviewed tons of people. It is so refreshing when you have somebody that's proactive. And even if, let's say, I were to ask a question, you can spin it to however you want to spin it and take it the direction that you want to go. That's the luxury of interviewing, being able to interview with your own opinion and specifically direction. So keep that in mind. The other thing that isn't talked about too often is the fact that people's energy will be focused where you tell it to go. When you answer questions, for example, have 2 to 3 anchor points that you can direct them to. So you're prepared and they'll notice the same themes. That's what I love. It'll keep it focused. So if you can focus on that, that'll be really helpful. So for example, I interviewed once many years ago when I was in HR. I was in the beginning of my career and I wanted to do corporate training really badly, but I had no experience except a few hours when I worked at the Gap in their corporate office. Well, when I got the opportunity to interview for this HR director position, I went into that interview with full gusto and fully armed with talking about corporate training because it's such a passion of mine. Now, notice I said I didn't have much experience except for a few hours, but guess what I talked about at that interview? Corporate training and how much I loved developing people and developing programs. As a result of that, that's what they walked away with. Classic example of people's energy will focus where you tell it to go. Again, you have more control than you think. What ended up happening is I got the job, and at day 2, the CFO came up to me and he said, Karen, I heard you have tons of training from working at the Gap. I've got all of my finance managers coming in from all around the world. Will you do a program on leadership for us? Just a couple of hours. Will you create something? And of course I said, yes. And then I turned around and thought, oh, how am I going to do this? And yet it was one of the best trainings to this day that I did. It was on leadership. And it just goes to show that passion is contagious and noticeable. You will be remembered for your passion. I'm sad to say that there are very few people in the context of the whole world who have strong dreams and talk about them. When you do that, when you talk about those passions, when you talk about vision, when you talk about a mission, there's something incredibly attractive about it. People want to hear about it. because people love hope and possibility, and that's what the world needs. So definitely keep that in mind. That will serve you well. The other thing to keep in mind, any of your answers, try to give an example. Try not to speak in vague generalities or things that just in general aren't concrete, because people can't picture that. They can't wrap their head around that. And it would be really helpful if you do that. So remember that some people are terrible interviewers, and that's a fact. So you've got to steer the interview in the direction that you want it to go. So for example, you may have to do the work for them by answering a question that you want them to ask. What that means is this: come ready with an example for each character trait or job qualification that you can show that you modeled that transfers well to this job. So let's say they ask some random question and you're thinking, this doesn't have anything to do with what I want to highlight. So you could answer it at first a little bit, whatever you think it might be, and then say, this reminds me about something I want to share with you about a time when I showed initiative. And I know that's a really important factor in this job. So here's an example of that. It was last year when da 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 da. The more you can do that, the more, first of all, you're going to make it a lot easier on the interviewer. You're going to make it easy for him or her to be able to go, oh, I can fully see and picture how she would fit into this. The other thing, this would be really bold. This is an extra bonus here, but you could potentially even, like when I used to interview people as coaches and trainers, I would often show them a video, because what I was coaching them and training them on is coaching other people on watching their videos to communicate better, to speak with influence. And what I would do is I would give them like a 30-second snippet of someone presenting, and I would say, how would you give this person feedback? Or I might say, what if somebody cried in your coaching session? How would you deal with that? These are all questions that I might ask, and maybe not all of them, but questions where it makes it difficult. So what if you had somebody who was argumentative and frustrated or didn't agree with the feedback that you gave? So whatever the situation, try to come up with something where you overcame a situation that maybe is a little bit unusual. If you can do that, you are really going to stand out from the crowd. And then the best thing that I can tell you about a follow-up to your interview is to make sure that you send a thank you. I would send an email thank you that same day, and then I would send a thank you note, a physical handwritten note. That may seem crazy nowadays, but it's really, really great. And think about it for yourself. The last time that you received a handwritten note in the mail or from someone, it stands out. So that's what I'd recommend. I would also, going back now to an additional tip, after the interview, while they're still there, you're shaking their hand to say goodbye, tell them, if it's true, that you want the job. Say, I'm really interested and I would like this job. Now, maybe not that direct, but it might be something like, I'm really interested and I wanted to reiterate that I would really like to work with you and be in this role, or something like that. You've got to find your own words, but those are the things that I'd recommend. So let's do a recap. Write out the one thing, be prepared with the one thing you want people interviewing to know about you, and lead with that when they say, tell me about yourself. Practice your intro using that PPU model. Say something personal, professional, and unique. Make a list of questions that you want them to ask and prepare for those. And remember, people's energy will be focused where you tell it to go. So when you answer, have those anchor points so that you can direct them and they'll notice the same themes as you answer. Also, because people are terrible interviewers, make sure that you answer in a behavioral example. So behavioral interviews are best technically, but what that means is to come ready with an example for whatever it is that you can map it to. Like what would you map flexibility to? What would you what would you match initiative to? What would you match positivity to? Any of those, or open to growth, open to feedback. You could bring that up proactively. You could say, hey, one more thing that I wanted to say, not everybody's open to feedback. And I wanted to tell you that that is something that I am really not only open to, but I seek out. And an example of that is at my last job when da, 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 da. Those are all great ways to emphasize and show, rather illustrate how it is that you have modeled those things in your past work. And there you have it. Those are some of my tips for how to prep and be ready to nail the interview and get that job. And that's a wrap of another episode of Ignite Your Confidence. I'm your host, Karen Laus. Thank you so much for listening. If you loved today's episode, please subscribe and leave a review. It helps other people find the podcast faster, and it certainly helps me. If you're interested in more tips and tools around confidence, please join me over in my Facebook group called Ignite Your Confidence with Karen Laus. Remember, you too can stand out with unshakable confidence.